Phantom Cattle. Part 1. The Night Pasture. The Texas night on I-20 west of Abilene was a void with texture. For Leo Garza, it was a familiar canvas. The hum of his Peterbilt's diesel was a meditation, the dashed white line a mantra leading him from El Paso's warehouses to Fort Worth's rail yards. He'd run this stretch of the old goodnight-loving trail 100 times, hauling auto parts instead of cattle, a modern vaquero of the asphalt. His grandfather's stories of the great drives were just that to him. Stories, full of dust and romance, sanitized by time. The first sign was the radio. One moment, it was a classic country station from Midland, George Strait's clear baritone filling the cab. The next, it dissolved into a torrent of hissing static, so loud and dense it was almost solid. Within the static, Leo could swear he heard fragments. A shouted Spanish curse, the high, trembling whinny of a horse in terror, the rhythmic, guttural chant of something that wasn't English. He reached to change the station. The digital display flickered, numbers spinning wildly before settling on 187.5 in glowing, impossible green. He frowned, thumping the dashboard. The static didn't clear. Instead, a new sound wove through it, a low, seismic rumble, felt more through the steering wheel than heard. Not an engine, not thunder, the sound of countless hooves. A shiver, unrelated to the cab's AC, traced his spine. He glanced at his phone, mounted on the dash for GPS. The map was there, but the highway was gone. In its place, a faint dashed line labeled Chisholm Trail, North Boundary, snaked across a featureless plain. His location pin pulsed over a marker that read, Camp Supply, 40 MI. His speed, a steady 68, now read 4.5 knots. East. What the hell? He muttered, his voice swallowed by the static. He looked back at the road and saw them. They emerged from the heat shimmer of his own headlights, not suddenly, but as if they'd always been there, just beyond the periphery. Longhorns, dozens of them. Their forms were translucent, a sepia-toned wash over the night. He could see the dark line of the highway through their rib cages, the faint glow of a ranch light miles away through a massive, sweeping horn. Their hooves made no sound on the asphalt, kicking up no dust, yet the ground-shaking rumble in the static intensified. Their eyes didn't reflect light, they generated it, a cold, sickly phosphorescence, the color of marsh gas or old bone. Phantom cattle. The words surfaced from a deep well of childhood memory, from his abuelo's fireside tales told not to entertain, but to warn. El ganado fantasma. The herd that never rested. You see them, mijo. You do not look away. You do not run. You give them the road, and you pray your engine is louder than their silence. Leo's foot instinctively lifted from the accelerator. The rig began to slow. As it did, the spectral herd adjusted. They didn't speed up or slow down. Their pace was eternal, a slow, plodding march of despair. But they flowed across the lanes, their translucent bodies becoming denser, more real, until they were a solid, shifting wall of horn and hide and ghost light directly in his path. A panic, cold and primal, seized him. This wasn't a hallucination. The cab smelled different now, not of diesel and stale coffee, but of dry prairie grass, sun-baked leather, and the sweet rot stench of a poorly buried carcass. The temperature dropped 10 degrees. His breath fogged the windshield. His GPS screen flashed. The Chisholm Trail line was now a bright, demanding red. A new, automated voice, dry as parchment, spoke from the speakers, cutting through the static. Off trail, correct course. Off trail, correct course. He was being herded. The rational part of his brain, the part that balanced logbooks and navigated traffic, screamed at him to stop, to call 911. But another, older instinct passed down in his blood, whispered otherwise. If you stop, you join the herd. If you run, you become lost. Gripping the wheel until his knuckles ached, Leo did the only thing that felt both insane and correct. He gently pressed the accelerator again, edging the rig forward. He didn't try to blast through them. He couldn't. Instead, he aimed for a gap, a slight parting in the spectral mass, as if he were a rider on the flank, gently guiding the flow. The moment his front grille neared the translucent animals, the world warped. The highway asphalt seemed to soften, its black turning to a rutted, dusty ochre. The sound of his tires changed from a smooth hum to a crunch of gravel and dried mud. In his side mirror, the familiar shape of his trailer seemed to waver, its sleek metal container flickering for a heartbeat into the ragged canvas cover of a Conestoga wagon piled high with sacks. A face appeared at his passenger window. It was a man, riding a horse that was little more than a skeletal suggestion. The rider's face was gaunt, etched with a thirst that had killed him a century and a half ago. His eyes were the same swamp-light as the cattle. He looked at Leo, not with malice, but with a weary, shared recognition. His lips moved, and the static in the cab formed his words. Water. The creek is dust. For the love of God, water. Leo jerked his eyes forward, focusing on the taillights of a distant car that was, impossibly, still there on the real I-20. He focused on the feel of the modern steering wheel, the digital readout of his fuel gauge. He poured his will into the present. "This is my road," he said aloud, his voice trembling but firm. "This is my rig, my time." He didn't swerve. He didn't stop. He drove with a deliberate, respectful slowness right through the heart of the phantom herd. Horns passed through his cab, icy phantoms that made his teeth ache. The stench of death and despair was overwhelming. The pleading whispers of dead drovers filled his ears in English, Spanish, and Comanche. For 10 eternal minutes, he navigated the ghostly current. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the pressure eased. The radio snapped back to George Strait mid-chorus. The GPS showed I-20 clear and modern. The cab was warm again. In his rear view, the highway was dark and empty. But on the shoulder, just for a second, he saw the faint greenish afterimage of a lone longhorn watching him go. Then it faded, like the last ember of a campfire swallowed by the night. Leo pulled into the next truck stop, his hands shaking too badly to hold a coffee cup. He didn't speak of it to the bleary-eyed cashier. But as he walked back to his rig under the buzzing fluorescent lights, he saw an old-timer, a retired driver maybe, sitting on a bench whittling a piece of wood. The old man looked up, his eyes meeting Leo's. He didn't smile. He just gave a slow, knowing nod and made a subtle, rolling gesture with his hand, the timeless sign of a cowboy moving a herd along. Leo nodded back. He'd passed through. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him deeper than the phantom horns, that the night pasture was vast. And he was now marked as someone who had seen the herd. The road would never feel the same again. Part 2. The rules of the trail. Sleep after that was a fractured thing. Leo caught a few haunted hours in the bunk behind his seat, dreaming of dust-choked throats and the endless plodding sway of bovine spines. He woke to a sunrise that felt too bright, too new, a harsh apology for the night's depth. He checked his logs, his freight manifests, the solid, mundane reality of bills of lading. They were anchors, but the memory of the swamp-light eyes was a hook in his soul, tugging him back towards that permeable border between now and then. He mentioned it once over a crackling CB channel to a driver he knew only by handle. Montana Mike. He kept it vague. You ever get weird radio skip out near the old trail routes? Like old-timey sounds? The silence on the channel was longer than usual. Then Mike's voice came back, stripped of its usual bravado. The Ghost Drive. Yeah, you see 'em? You don't talk about 'em much. Rules of the road, partner. Rules? Leo asked, the word feeling heavy. Rule 1. Your rig is your horse. You leave it, you're on foot in their world. Rule 2. You hold your line. No sudden moves, no panic. You're a drover sharing the trail, not a stampeder. Rule 3. You don't take their bait. They'll show you things you want to see. A working oasis, a town lit up warm, a woman waving. It's all dust and thirst. You drive on. Mike signed off without another word. The advice was less comforting than terrifying. It confirmed everything. It meant there was a protocol, a survival lore passed among the modern knights of the highway for an encounter that wasn't supposed to exist. Leo's next run was south, down US 83, another arrow-straight scar over the staked plains that once echoed with the shouts of the Great Western Trail. He was hyper-aware now, watching the edges of his headlights like a sailor watches for reefs. The second encounter wasn't a herd. It was a ghostly band of horses. They materialized in the median, running parallel to him, silent and frantic, their coats gleaming with an unnatural sweat that looked like mercury. Among them ran the figures of drovers, their chaps flapping soundlessly, their faces blurred masks of exhaustion. This time, Leo was ready. He didn't slow down. He didn't speed up. He held his steady 65, his hands loose on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the spectral stampede. Just sharing the trail, he murmured, a mantra to the rhythm of the engine. The radio stayed mercifully silent, but the CB buzzed with a faint, distant echo of the same spectral comm chatter Mike had warned him about. He passed through. The cold seeped into the cab, and the smell of horse sweat and fear was sharp, but it faded. He felt a grim sense of accomplishment. He was learning the rules. His third encounter was the one that tested him. It was on a remote farm-to-market road, a shortcut he'd taken 1,000 times, a ribbon of cracked asphalt that followed the dry bed of the Palo Duro Creek. The phantom cattle were here, but they were different. They weren't moving. They stood stock still in a broad, flat field to his right, hundreds of them, heads lowered, facing a single point, a ghostly, shimmering outline of a windmill, its fan turning slowly in a non-existent breeze. Beneath it stood the clear, heartbreaking figure of a woman in a pioneer dress, holding an empty bucket, one hand shielding her eyes as she looked into the distance. It was a tableau of yearning, a silent, collective prayer for water. The pull was immense. It wasn't fear this time, but a profound, soul-crushing pity. The logic of the haunting unfolded in his mind. This wasn't just trauma, it was a loop, a moment of ultimate need, frozen and replayed for eternity. The herd, the woman, they were waiting for a deliverance that would never come. And in that moment, his headlights illuminated a sign, real and rusted, planted near the fence line. Wells dry, turn back. A modern sign for modern travelers. A conflict erupted within him. The cowboy protocol said to drive on. But the human in him, the descendant of people who knew thirst, screamed to help, to acknowledge their suffering. As he wrestled with it, he saw the woman turn, not towards the windmill, but towards him. Her face was no longer hopeful, but eerily serene. She smiled, a sad, empty smile, and raised her hand, not in warning, but in invitation. An invitation to stop, to share the weight. The cab grew cold. The dashboard lights flickered. His GPS screen dissolved into a hand-drawn map on yellowed parchment, an X marking a reliable spring to my east. It was bait. Mike's Rule 3. A mirage of salvation. Leo's foot hovered over the brake. The pity was a physical ache. But he heard his grandfather's voice, not from memory, but as if the old man were in the bunk behind him. The desert doesn't forgive a soft heart, mijo. It uses it. You cannot give water to a ghost. You can only refuse to become one. Gritting his teeth, Leo forced his foot to the accelerator. He tore his eyes from the woman's pleading smile and focused on the real, crumbling asphalt ahead. As he passed the scene, he did one thing, not in the rules, but from a deep, cultural instinct. He reached over, rolled down his window, and into the freezing, silent night air, he poured out the last of his water bottle onto the roadside dirt. A libation, not for them to drink, but an acknowledgement. I see your thirst. I carry my own. The moment he did, the spectral scene flickered. The woman's smile softened, just for an instant, into something like gratitude. Then she, the windmill, and the entire silent, suffering herd dissolved into a shower of cold, greenish sparks that were swallowed by the dark. He'd passed the test, but he'd also changed the ritual. He had engaged, and in the world of spirits, engagement is a form of relationship. Days later, at a dusty diner in Lubbock, he found his lore master. The old-timer from the truck stop was there, sitting alone in a corner booth. Leo slid in across from him. The man didn't look up from his pie. I poured out water, Leo said quietly. The old man, who'd introduced himself only as Harlan, finally met his gaze. His eyes were the color of the sky before a dry storm. I heard. That was either the dumbest or the bravest thing a driver's done on the trail in 50 years. What does it mean? It means you offered respect. Not many do anymore. They just fear or ignore. The herd, it remembers respect, but it also remembers debts. Harlan pushed his plate away. You've been marked twice now. Once by seeing, once by acknowledging. The next time you meet them, it won't be an encounter. It'll be a summons. They'll have a job for you. A job? Leo felt a new kind of cold, one that had nothing to do with phantom chills. The ghost drive is stuck, son. It's a memory of a journey that never ended. Some say it needs something, a real living drover with a steel horse to finally lead a part of it home. To break the loop. Harlan leaned forward, his voice dropping. When it comes, you won't be able to just hold your line. You'll have to choose, drive through and damn them to another century of wandering, or pick a direction and lead. And God help you, you better lead them to the right place. Because if you lead them into a modern town, or a reservoir, or another dead end, you'll weave their tragedy right into the present, and you'll join the Remuda forever. Harlan left him with the bill and a final cryptic warning. They'll come for you where the trails cross, where the sorrow is thickest. Watch for the stone that remembers. Leo paid and walked out into the blinding sun. He was no longer just a trucker haunted by a ghost story. He was a potential participant in it. The rules had just gotten a lot more complicated. The open road ahead no longer promised freedom. It promised a rendezvous with a debt he hadn't asked for, but had willingly, foolishly, acknowledged. Part 3. The Crossing. The summons came not on a moonless night, but in a place. Harlan's words echoed in Leo's mind. Where the trails cross. He found himself, through a convoluted series of dispatches and deadhead runs he didn't fully remember requesting, pulling his rig into a forgotten rest stop at the junction of FM 1053 and a nameless dirt track. It was a concrete slab with a single dead picnic table, surrounded by miles of scrubland. The only notable feature was a large, flat sandstone rock near the table, its surface covered in petroglyph spirals, stick figure animals, and, unmistakably, the crude etchings of longhorn cattle. The stone that remembers. The sun was setting, bleeding the sky with the colors of a bruise. The air was perfectly still. No crickets, no wind. The silence was a physical presence, heavier than the humid twilight. Leo sat in his idling rig, the diesel rumble the only sound in the world. He knew. This was the place. He didn't have to wait long. As the last sliver of sun vanished, the world didn't go dark. It went pale. A low, greenish luminescence rose from the ground itself, like foxfire in a giant's graveyard. The petroglyphs on the stone began to glow, the etched cattle seeming to shift and stir. Then, from every point of the compass, they appeared. Not a herd, but the herd. The phantom cattle. Thousands upon thousands of them, materializing from the twilight, their forms more solid, more real than he had ever seen. Their swamp-light eyes were no longer distant. They were fixed on him, on his truck. He was no longer an observer on the flank. He was at the point. Behind the cattle came the drovers. Dozens of ghostly riders, their faces clear now, a mix of Anglo, Tejano, and Comanche, all wearing the same expression of weary, desperate resolve. At their head rode a figure Leo recognized, the gaunt man from his first encounter. He held up a skeletal hand, and the immense, silent herd halted. The cab plunged into deep freeze. The dashboard died. The engine didn't stall. It was simply silenced, as if sound itself had been outlawed. On the dead radio screen, words formed in the same glowing green. Lead us. This was it. The job. Harlan was right. He couldn't just drive through. The herd surrounded the rest stop, a silent, waiting sea. They were giving him the respect he'd shown them, the respect of a lead drover. And they were waiting for his command. His mind raced. Led them where? To a modern stockyard? A slaughterhouse? That would be a cruel jest. To a river? Most were dammed or dry. To the Gulf? An impossible journey through populated lands. He thought of the pity in the pioneer woman's eyes. The thirst. The journey that never ended. He looked at the petroglyphs, glowing with ancient memory. This land remembered water not as a resource, but as a spirit. The old trails didn't just go north to market. They followed ancient paths to springs, to sacred watering holes. The ghost drive wasn't just lost. It was severed from its destination. It needed not a place on a map, but a conclusion, a release. An idea, born of equal parts desperation and inspiration, struck him. He couldn't take them to water, but he could take them to the memory of water, to a place where the land itself sang of it. He remembered his grandfather speaking of La Canción del Agua, the song of the water, a place in the far west, where the Pecos River had once carved through limestone, creating a canyon so deep, the sound of the vanished river was said to still echo in the wind. A place where, in legend, the spirits of animals and men who died of thirst could finally drink from the echo and find peace. It was a folk tale, a children's story. But in a world of phantom cattle, what was more real? A GPS coordinate or a story that had shaped the land's soul? His hands, numb with cold, gripped the wheel. He leaned out of the silent cab and spoke, his voice a ragged scrap of sound in the immense quiet. I'll lead, you follow, to the song. He had no idea if they understood words. He turned the key in the dead ignition. It clicked. Nothing. He closed his eyes, not praying, but willing. He thought of the rumble of his diesel, the feel of the road, the purpose of a journey. He poured his own memory of movement, of driving with a destination into the metal around him. With a shudder that seemed to come from the earth, the engine coughed. Then it roared to life, a shocking, defiant sound in the spectral silence. The headlights blazed, cutting through the pale gloom. The herd didn't flinch. They parted before him, creating a wide avenue leading west. Leo put the rig in gear. He drove slowly off the concrete slab onto the dirt track heading west. He didn't look at his GPS. He navigated by the feel of the land, by the pressure in his chest that pulled him toward the setting sun's afterglow. In his mirrors, he saw the impossible. The phantom cattle fell in behind him, a river of silent, glowing beasts following an 18-wheeler instead of a line of riders. The ghostly drovers rode the flanks, their forms blending with the dust kicked up by his real tire's dust that, for the first time, he could see and here. It was the long drive, resurrected, a living man in a machine of the present, leading the sorrow of the past towards a mythical redemption. The journey was outside of time. The road under his tires shifted from asphalt to hardpan to sandy wash and back again. The stars above were too bright, too close. Constellations he didn't recognize swam in the sky. He passed landmarks that shouldn't exist. A trading post that was ashes before his grandfather was born. A creek bed that briefly ran with silver water under the greenish light. He drove, and the endless herd followed, their plodding hooves now making a faint, synchronized whisper on the earth, a sound like a distant, mournful river. He drove until the land began to fall away, until the air grew sharp and cool. He saw the jagged black silhouette of canyon walls against the starry sky. He had reached the edge of the Pecos, not the river, but the great gap it left behind. He stopped his rig at the very rim of the canyon, a chasm of darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the ghost light. He stepped out into the silent, freezing air. Behind him, the herd and the drovers gathered, a silent, expectant multitude stretching back into the vanished plains. Leo stood at the edge, feeling the updraft from the abyss. He listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, as if his arrival had triggered it, a wind rose from the depths. It wasn't just wind. It was a sound, a deep, resonant, rushing sigh, the ghost of a river, the memory of torrents, la canción del agua, the song of the water. He turned to face the phantom cattle and their keepers. He raised his arm, not in command, but in release, and pointed into the canyon toward the song. The lead drover, the gaunt man, nodded. He raised a spectral hand to the brim of his non-existent hat in a gesture of thanks. Then he turned his horse and, without a sound, rode straight over the edge of the cliff. The horse did not fall. It descended, as if on an invisible slope, into the echoing darkness. One by one, the drovers followed. Then, the cattle. They flowed over the rim in a silent, glowing waterfall, a cascade of sorrow pouring into the canyon's song. As each form descended, it seemed to soften, to lose its sharp, anguished edges. The swamp light in their eyes dimmed, not to darkness, but to a gentle silver luminescence, like moonlight on water. Leo watched until the last longhorn vanished into the deep, until the canyon's song seemed to grow fuller, richer, as if absorbing the quiet footsteps of a million hooves. The greenish glow faded from the land. The stars snapped back to their familiar patterns. The world was just a world again. He was alone on the canyon rim, his truck a solid, mundane shadow behind him. The air was warm. Crickets chirped. In the east, the first hint of true dawn tinged the sky. He drove back to the main highway as the sun rose. At the first truck stop, he bought a coffee and stood in the sun, feeling its heat seep into his bones. His radio worked. His GPS showed his true location. Everything was normal. But when he climbed back into his cab, he saw it. On his passenger seat, where nothing had been, lay a single, perfect cattle horn, old and polished to a deep amber, its tip bound in faded rawhide. It was no phantom. It was solid, real, a token. He picked it up. It felt warm. He held it to his ear, not expecting anything. And from deep within the spiral of the horn, he heard it, faint, distant, and peaceful, the sound of moving water. The Crude Curse. Part 1. The First Seep. The Permian Basin in West Texas wasn't a place. It was a testament. A testament to grit, to greed, and to the deep, silent hunger of the world for what lay festering below. For every gleaming new fracking operation with its computerized pumps and halogen lights, there were 100 forgotten relics. Skeletal pump jacks, their heads frozen in mid-bob like praying mantises caught in rust. weathered wooden derricks leaning like drunk sentinels, and the towns that had bloomed and withered with the booms, leaving behind husks of buildings with "for-lean" peeling from the windows. Ezekiel Zeke Rollins knew these ghost fields better than anyone. A third-generation roughneck turned independent scout, he was a ghost hunter of a different sort. Companies hired him to assess old, played-out claims, to see if new tech could squeeze a few more barrels of profit from the stone. He drove a modified Ford Raptor, its bed carrying core samples, a drone, and a healthy dose of cynicism. He also carried the stories, the ones told in dim honky-tonks over warm beer. Stories of the oil ghosts. Old-timers swore that in the derelict fields, particularly around the cursed Holloway 17 site where a blowout in '58 had killed 11 men, you didn't just see things, you encountered them. Shapes in the oil-slicked rain puddles that moved against the wind. A feeling of being watched from the black mouth of a capped well. And sometimes, if the moon was wrong and the wind blew from the south, you'd see them. The crude dogs. Formless, shifting masses of what looked like pure liquid tar, sloughing off viscous droplets as they loped between the creosote bushes on pseudopods that resembled legs. They didn't attack. They just observed. With a sentience that was ancient, hungry, and deeply, profoundly wrong. Zeke dismissed it as bullshit, the product of bad whiskey and lonely desert nights, until the night he scouted the old Mesquite Queen lease for Blackbriar Energy. Blackbriar was new money, aggressive, all about the latest tech. They'd bought up a swath of played-out land south of Odessa, convinced their proprietary deep frac horizon technology could unlock a previously untouched shale layer 2 miles down. Zeke's job was to do a final surface survey before the big rigs moved in. The Mesquite Queen was a graveyard. A dozen silent pump jacks stood in a silent metal forest. The ground was stained a permanent rainbow sheen black. The air smelled of ozone, crude, and something else. A sweet, cloying decay like rotten eggs and forgotten meat. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in oil-slick colors of purple and orange, Zeke sent up his drone for a thermal pass. The screen showed the expected heat signatures of cooling metal and warm sand. And then, something else. In the center of the field, near the capped wellhead of the original Queen No. 1, the ground glowed with a cold, inverse signature. It was a pool of utter black on the thermal, absorbing all heat. And it was moving, spreading like ink in water, but against the gentle slope of the land. It was coalescing into a shape, a low, broad shape with 4 distinct cold blotches. A crude dog, and it was big. A low-frequency hum vibrated up through the floorboards of his truck, a subsonic thrum that made his fillings ache. The stories said that was the sound of the earth groaning, of the pressurized dead zone far below. The drone's camera feed fizzed with static. In the last clear image, Zeke saw the thing turn. It had no face, but a depression formed in its front, a swirling vortex of darker black. It felt like being stared at by a hole in the world. He recalled the truck and got the hell out of there. At the Blackbriar site office trailer, he tried to report it to the site manager, a slick, impatient man named Davis. "Environmental anomaly," Davis said, not looking up from his tablet. "Probably a bacterial mat feeding on seepage. We'll note it in the remediation phase. The deep frac goes ahead tomorrow." "It's not bacteria," Zeke insisted, his voice tight. "That's the old Queen No. 1, the '58 blowout site. The ground's unstable. Psychically, if not geologically." Davis finally looked at him, a smirk playing on his lips. "Psychically? Rollins, I pay you for dirt samples, not ghost stories. The techs have done their seismic. The shale layer is virgin under immense pressure. A perfect target. We crack it open and we'll be swimming in light, sweet crude. The ghosts, as you call them, will be flushed out with the first flowback water." Zeke left, a knot of dread in his gut. He'd heard that arrogant confidence before, from men who thought the Earth was a vending machine you could just punch until your treat fell out. The deep frack operation was a spectacle of modern industrial might. Millions of gallons of water, sand, and a proprietary cocktail of chemicals were pumped down into the Earth at pressures meant to shatter rock. Zeke watched from a distant ridge, his binoculars trained on the site. The ground shuddered. The hum he'd felt became a palpable vibration in the air. Then, it happened. It wasn't the geyser of oil they'd hoped for. It was a sigh. A deep, wet, exhausted exhalation from the wellhead. What came out wasn't golden crude. It was a viscous, pitch-black slurry, shot through with iridescent rainbows of toxicity. It didn't gush. It oozed with a terrible, sentient slowness. And it stank not just of oil, but of a million-year-old graveyard, of sulfur, and of a sweet, metallic scent that could only be blood from a vein that was never meant to be opened. The workers cheered at first, thinking it was just heavy crude. Then the slurry hit the containment pit, and it didn't settle. It began to climb the polymer-lined walls, defying gravity, forming tendrils that quested over the rim. The hum became a deafening roar in the mind, a psychic static that drove men to their knees, hands clamped over their ears. From the main flow, shapes began to pull themselves free. Not just crude dogs. Humanoid forms, clumsy and dripping, their features blurred as if made of melting wax. They were the echoes of the 58 crew, and of things far, far older, all churned together in the black amniotic fluid of the basin. One of the shapes reached a shimmering, tar-black arm towards a fleeing technician. It didn't grab him. It simply brushed his coveralls. The man screamed, not in pain, but in profound cellular horror. He fell, convulsing. When they pulled him back, the stain was already there on his forearm. A handprint of perfect, glossy black, like wet crude, but impossible to wash off. It seeped into his skin, a living tattoo of oil. Zeke didn't wait to see more. He sped away from the ridge, the rearview mirror showing the Blackbriar site being consumed not by fire, but by a slow, rising tide of sentient, sorrowful blackness. The containment had failed. The reservoir wasn't just oil. It was a cyst of geologic trauma, of fossilized death and industrial sin. And Blackbriar had just lanced it. The curse wasn't a legend anymore. It was a spill. And it was spreading. Part 2. The Staining. The town of Reedville, 20 miles downwind and downstream from the Mesquite Queen, slept the uneasy sleep of a place living on borrowed time. It had survived boom and bust, its lifeblood always the black gold. Now it was about to be consumed by a darker vintage. The first evidence in town wasn't a monster, it was the water. Old Mrs. Henderson called the municipal office to complain her tap water was smelling like a rotten mechanic's shop. Then the birds fell silent. Then the stray dogs began to whine and pace, digging at the ground as if trying to escape something rising from below. Zeke rolled into Reedville as the sun was setting, his truck now feeling like a tin can in a gathering storm. He went straight to the only person who might listen, Doc Alvarez, the town's weary, seen-it-all physician. He found the doc in his small clinic, examining young Kyle Davis, the site manager's son who'd been visiting his father. The boy was pale, shivering, and on his left cheek was a small, dime-sized blotch of perfect black. It looked like a drop of ink, but it seemed to pulse faintly, and its edges were slowly, infinitesimally, creeping outward. "He says it doesn't hurt," Doc Alvarez said, his voice low. "It itches, and he hears a humming, a deep sound, like a diesel engine idling under the house." Kyle looked at Zeke with wide, terrified eyes. "It talks in the hum. It says, 'It's thirsty. It's so old and thirsty.'" Zeke showed the doc the photos from his drone, the thermal images of the cold, spreading black. He told him about the flowback at Blackbriar. Doc Alvarez, a man of science, listened to the impossible story, his face growing grayer with each word. He'd treated roughnecks with chemical burns, with H2S exposure. This was different. This was a pathogen of place. That night, the first full manifestation hit Reedville. It wasn't an attack. It was an emergence. In the vacant lot behind the shuttered diner, where an old, unsealed monitoring well was hidden by weeds, the ground softened. Not into mud, but into a thick, sucking tar pit. And from it, a figure rose. It was human-sized, a silhouette of dripping blackness. It had the approximate shape of a man in coveralls and a hard hat, but the details were liquid, running. It stood there, swaying slightly, and then it began to walk with a slow, deliberate slog towards Main Street. Where its feet fell, the asphalt didn't crack. It darkened, becoming soft and spongy, leaving permanent, oily footprints. Panic, when it came, was a quiet, stunned thing. People watched from behind locked doors as the oil ghost shambled down the center of the street. Sheriff Miller, a brave but unimaginative man, tried to stop it. He stepped out, ordered it to halt, then fired his shotgun when it didn't. The blast tore a hole clean through the thing's chest. Black, viscous fluid splattered the storefront behind it, but the figure didn't stagger. The hole sealed itself over in seconds, like a film of oil on water closing. It turned its featureless head towards the sheriff. A tendril, swift as a whip, lashed out from its mass, wrapping around the sheriff's wrist. He screamed. It wasn't a burn, but a deep, freezing cold that shot up his arm. The tendril retracted, leaving a thick, black band around his wrist, already sinking into his skin. The ghost then simply turned and continued its slow march, leaving the sheriff staring at the impossible stain, his weapon useless. The ghost walked to the town's lone water tower, leaned against one of its steel legs, and seemed to melt. It flowed down the metal and into the ground at the base, vanishing. But the leg it had touched was now stained with a weeping black patina that crept upwards. The infection had a vector, touch, and a goal: the town's infrastructure, its water. Zeke and Doc Alvarez formed a desperate, unofficial crisis cell. They tracked the occurrences. The stain spread on the infected people at a rate proportional to their stress and fear. Kyle's blotch was now the size of a silver dollar. Sheriff Miller's band had become a slick black glove reaching to his elbow. The infected reported the hum growing louder, and now they began to see things, shadows moving in any pool of dark liquid. The faces of long-dead roughnecks reflected in puddles of rainwater. Worst of all, they felt a pull, a magnetic attraction to places of oil history. The old derrick in the town park, the rusting pump jack used as a monument, the basement of the hardware store where drilling records were kept. The curse was tying them to its geography, turning living people into future anchors for more ghosts. Blackbriar Energy, in the person of a terrified and now stained Davis, finally arrived in town with a private security team. They didn't come to help. They came to contain the information. They set up a quarantine zone around the infected part of town, using the rhetoric of a toxic chemical spill. They offered buyouts, hushed settlements, all while their men in unmarked trucks used industrial heaters and chemical dispersants on the oil ghosts. It was like trying to melt a glacier with a hairdryer. The heat made the ghosts shimmer and evaporate a foul mist, but the core mass simply reformed elsewhere. The chemicals just made the rainbows in their sludge more violently toxic. Zeke confronted Davis in his temporary trailer office. The manager's neck was now marbled with black veins. "You have to stop all extraction," Zeke said. "Every well, fracked or not, in a 50-mile radius. You're giving it pressure pathways." "It's a fluid dynamics problem," Davis hissed, his eyes wide with a feverish mix of terror and greed. "We just need to find the right viscosity breaker, the right solvent." "This isn't a problem you solve," Zeke shouted. "It's a sin you appease. You opened a wound in the earth that's been festering since before dinosaurs. You can't put a Band-Aid on it." But Davis was already lost, listening to the hum, dreaming of reclaiming his prize from the dark. That night, the second phase began. The infected, drawn by the pull, started walking in their sleep. Kyle Davis walked out of his house and stood for hours under the weeping water tower. Sheriff Miller drove his cruiser to the old Mesquite Queen site and was found standing motionless in the midst of the silent pump jacks, his blackened arm outstretched as if feeling for a heartbeat in the ground. Zeke and Doc Alvarez realized the terrible truth. The crude curse didn't just make ghosts from old oil and bones. It was making new ones. It was converting the living, turning them into nodes of suffering, tethering their agony to specific locations, where they would eventually die and become the next generation of oil ghosts, forever bound to repeat their final moments of despair. Reedville wasn't just being haunted, it was being seeded. The town itself was becoming a living oil field of perpetual sorrow. And the drilling had only just begun. Part 3. The cementing. The heart of Reedville was dying from the inside out. The water from the towers now ran with a faint iridescent sheen and the sweet rot stench of the deep curse. Those who drank it reported faint stains forming on their tongues. The infected, now a dozen townsfolk, including a child, were kept in Doc Alvarez's clinic, a makeshift hospice for the spiritually condemned. Their stains spread like slow-moving bruises, mapping their circulatory systems in slick black tributaries. Their whispers harmonized with the ever-present hum, a chorus of terrestrial anguish. Zeke knew they were losing. Containment had failed. Blackbriar's solutions were just more violations, stirring the curse into greater fury. He needed older knowledge. He drove out to the trailer of Elijah Crow, a Comanche elder who'd refused all buyouts and lived on a scrap of land that had been in his family long before the first derrick pierced the sky. Elijah was said to know the stories that weren't in history books, the stories of what the land remembered. He found the old man sitting under a mesquite tree, watching the southern horizon with eyes the color of dried clay. He didn't turn as Zeke approached. "The black blood is awake," Elijah said, his voice a dry rustle. "You do not drill into a tomb and expect the sleeper to thank you." "Can it be put back to sleep?" Zeke asked, desperation stripping away all pretense. Elijah was silent for a long time. "You cannot cap a wound that has festered. The poison is out. It seeks to make the world in its image, cold, black, and still." He finally looked at Zeke. "But a river can be diverted. A spirit can be given a purpose other than hunger." He spoke of the old ways, not of combat, but of negotiation. The substance below was a confluence. Ancient, decayed life fossilized into oil, mixed with the violent deaths and trauma of the industrial age. It was grief made liquid. You couldn't kill grief, but you could offer it a shape, a focus, a vessel to hold it all. "The men who first pierced the earth here," Elijah said, "they are part of it now. Their fear, their pain, they are the seeds of the ghosts you see. To calm the storm, you must calm the seed." An idea, monstrous and perfect, formed in Zeke's mind. Davis, the Blackbriar manager, was the key. He was the architect of this new wound, and his body was now deeply seated with the curse. He was becoming a nexus. He wasn't just infected. He was a future wellspring. Zeke returned to Reedville as the town convulsed. A new ghost, larger than any before, had formed from the pooled runoff near the school, a grotesque, multi-limbed thing that seemed to be made of fused machinery and human forms. Blackbriar's security, in a final act of stupidity, tried to use a controlled detonation. The explosion didn't destroy the ghost. It shattered it into 100 smaller, skittering horrors that seeped into the town's sewer system. It was the last straw. Zeke found Davis in his trailer, staring at a live feed of the Mesquite Queen site, which was now a bubbling black lake. The stain covered half his face, his eye behind it glowing with a sickly reflected sheen. "You were right about one thing," Zeke said quietly, not entering. It's about fluid dynamics and pressure. You created a high-pressure zone of suffering. We need to create a low-pressure zone, a vacuum to draw it in. Davis turned, his expression one of pathetic hope. A new pump? A different chemical draw? A sacrifice, Zeke corrected. The oldest kind. You open the tomb. You have to be the one to close it. Not by leaving, by staying, by letting it all flow into you, and then stopping. Understanding, then terror, then a strange, hungry acceptance flickered across Davis's stained face. The hum was loudest for him. It promised an end to the itching, the fear. It promised to make him the center of something vast. The curse wanted to coalesce, to find a single, stable form. A permanent ghost, rooted to the source of the trauma. Let it take you completely, Zeke pressed, his voice cold. Become the vessel. Let every drop of that black grief in this town flow to you. And then we'll give you what you originally wanted. A cap, a permanent seal. The plan was a blasphemous perversion of the oilman's art. They wouldn't pump the crude out. They would pump the curse in. They would use Davis as the ultimate injection well. Doc Alvarez, horrified but out of options, agreed. They evacuated the remaining healthy townsfolk north, under the pretext of a mandatory environmental evacuation. The infected, including young Kyle and Sheriff Miller, they brought to the Mesquite Queen site. The Blackbriar security, leaderless and terrified, fled. Under Elijah Crow's distant, guiding gaze, they worked through the night. They used Blackbriar's own equipment against the curse. They didn't pump water and sand. They used the infected people as focal points. Zeke and the doc led each stained individual to the edge of the black lake that had been the wellhead. As they stood there, drawn by the horrific pull, the oil ghosts that haunted the town began to respond. They flowed from the sewers, peeled off walls, rose from puddles, a river of living crude streaming back to its source, drawn by the concentrated human suffering now gathered at its birthplace. The ghosts didn't attack the infected. They flowed into them, especially into Davis, who stood at the very lip of the well, arms spread. The black stains on the people pulsed, and the free-floating ghosts merged with them, their substance adding to the internal tide. One by one, the infected townsfolk collapsed, not in death, but in a final silent absorption. Their bodies didn't vanish. They became still, statuesque, their skin hardening into obsidian-like crust, their forms forever fixed in poses of terminal exhaustion or prayer. They became permanent monuments, anchors of solidified sorrow. Davis was the last. He glowed now from within with the dark light of the curse, a human-shaped void. The remaining ghosts, the entire released reservoir of grief, poured into him. He swelled, distorted, his form losing all humanity, becoming a towering, writhing column of pure, anguished blackness. The hum was deafening, a physical wall of sound. Then, with Elijah's signal, Zeke triggered the final phase. Using a modified cement truck from the Blackbriar site, they began pumping not concrete, but a slurry of blessed silver sand provided by Elijah, salt from ancient inland seas, and the pulverized petals of desert flowers that bloomed only after fire, a recipe for binding and forgetting. They pumped it directly into the base of the Davis thing, into the original cursed wellhead. They were cementing the well, not with rock, but with ritual. The black column screamed a sound of 1,000 dying wells and lost men. It fought, tendrils lashing out, but it was tethered to the hardening forms of the other infected, to the geography of its own rage. The binding slurry mixed with the cursed substance, not destroying it, but paralyzing it, fossilizing it anew. As dawn broke, the scene at the Mesquite Queen was one of horrific, silent sculpture. A circle of blackened humanoid forms stood frozen around the wellhead, and in the center, where Davis had stood, was a grotesque, beautiful spire of layered black and silver, like a twisted obsidian tree, forever weeping slow, clear tears of salt water. The hum was gone. The air, while still tainted with old oil, had lost its sweet rot edge. The ground was solid. Reedville was saved, but it was a cemetery. The water tower would have to be torn down. The land would be uninhabitable for generations, a cursed zone sealed by a crude, brutal magic. Zeke stood with Doc Alvarez, looking at the monument they had created. They hadn't defeated the crude curse. They had given it a tombstone. And they had learned the terrible final law of the oil fields. For every barrel you take, you must someday give something back. Not in money, but in memory. Not in profit, but in pain. The black blood was quiet now, but it was still there, dreaming its cold, liquid dreams under the silver sand cap. And somewhere, someone else was already looking at a seismic map, dreaming of the pressure below and wondering what new horror the next fracture might release. Witness for the Case, 429. Part 1. The 13th Man in the Photograph. The Gonzales County Courthouse was a monument to Texan gravity. Built from local limestone the color of old bones, it dominated the square with its clock tower and blind, dignified windows. For attorney Sam Holloway, it was a second home, a labyrinth of polished oak, echoing marble halls and the dry, sacred scent of law books and dust. He was a modern man in a historic shell, a public defender who believed in the system even when it creaked. His current case was a difficult one. Case Nutter 429, the state of Texas versus Miguel Reyes, a young ranch hand accused of killing his foreman, Boyd Hackett, during a pay dispute in a remote section of the Callahan Spread. The evidence was circumstantial but heavy. Miguel's fingerprints on a bloody wrench found near the body, witnesses to the heated argument, and a history of tension. The motive was classic. The county, still reeling from shifting demographics and economic strain, smelled blood. Sam saw a scared kid, poor English, and a prosecution eager for a quick, clean win. Preparing his defense, Sam spent long nights in the courthouse's archival annex, a musty basement room lined with ledger books and cardboard boxes. He was looking for precedent, for anything to humanize Miguel. Instead, he found an anomaly. It was in a box labeled 1931-1935 MISC Trials. He was skimming through a faded folder for a trespassing case when a loose photograph slipped out. It was a courtroom scene, black and white, the caption scrawled on the back in fountain pen. State versus J. McCullough. Sentencing, October 12, 1932. The gallery was packed with men in hats and women in severe dresses. The judge, stern and walrus-mustached, loomed above. Sam's eyes traveled over the faces, a sea of historical judgment, and stopped. In the back row, near the fire exit, stood a man who didn't belong. He was slightly out of focus, as if he'd moved, but his attire was starkly clear. A dark, modern-looking pullover sweater, crisp jeans, and short, contemporary hair. His face was pale, indistinct, but he was looking directly at the camera, while everyone else was focused on the bench. A chill, unrelated to the basement's damp, touched Sam's spine. A prank? A later edition? But the photo was original, the paper brittle, the emulsion cracked with age. The modern man was in the cracks. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a strange developing error. He tucked the photo away, but the image of that pale, anachronistic face stayed with him. The next day, in the modern record room, he listened to a reel-to-reel tape from a 1975 armed robbery trial, hoping to find a procedural error he could use. The sound was tinny, full of hiss. The prosecutor was badgering a witness. Prosecutor: You expect this court to believe you just happened to be at the bus station at 3 a.m.? Witness: It's the truth, I swear. There was a pause on the tape, the hiss of empty space. And then, clear as day, a sound that wasn't on the log. A deep, shuddering, wet sigh, a sound of pure, exhausted despair. It was followed by 3 soft, distinct taps, like knuckles on wood. Then the tape resumed with the judge gaveling for order. Sam rewound, played it again. The sigh was there. The taps were there. The court clerk's log for that tape listed only the prosecutor, the witness, the judge, and the defense attorney. No one else was recorded. That night, working late in his 4th-floor office, he felt it. A sudden, oppressive cold that settled in the corner of the room near the bookcase. The smell of old pipe tobacco and something sharper liniment, maybe, or cheap hair tonic wafted through the air, cutting through the scent of coffee and paper. He looked up from his brief. In the dark window, a reflection of his own room, he saw for a fraction of a second the silhouette of a man in a broad-brimmed hat sitting in his client's chair. He spun around. The chair was empty. He was tired, stressed. The mind plays tricks. But the tricks became more insistent. Walking down the grand marble staircase, he caught a flicker in the polished brass of the handrail. A reflection of a woman in a cloche hat and 1920s dress, weeping silently behind him. He turned. The landing was empty. In the men's room, the mirror above the sink would, for a heartbeat, show the gaunt, terrified face of a young man with a bruised eye staring over his shoulder. The tap water sometimes ran rust-brown for a second before clearing. The courthouse was whispering to him, and the whispers grew louder as the Reyes case progressed. During a pre-trial hearing, as Sam argued a motion to suppress the wrench, he felt a sudden, constricting pressure around his throat, as if a coarse rope were being tightened. He gasped, stumbling over his words. The judge frowned. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, leaving a phantom ache and the taste of dust and adrenaline in his mouth. He saw the bailiff, an old-timer named Roy, watching him with a knowing, grim expression. Sam cornered Roy in the hallway after. "What was that?" Roy leaned against the cool limestone wall, his voice low. "This old building, it don't forget, Mr. Holloway. It's seen a lot of truth, and a whole lot more lies. Sometimes, when a case comes along that rhymes with an old one, the building gets restless. It starts showing you its scrapbook." "What are you talking about?" Sam demanded, but the chill was back. "Case number 429, Roy said, nodding toward Sam's file. "You should look up case number 114 from 1932, the state of Texas versus Jeremiah McCullough." The name from the photograph. Cowhand. Accused of murdering his ranch boss, a man named Thaddeus Boone, in a pay dispute. One witness, a shaky, bloody hammer, a town ready to believe the worst of a... Well, let's just say Jeremiah wasn't from a popular family around here. What happened? They convicted him in 2 days. He was hanged in the jail yard out back before the appeal could even be filed. Protested his innocence to the last breath. Some folks later said the real killer was Boone's own son, who'd gotten into debt. But the law had moved on. Roy spat a stream of tobacco into a nearby brass spittoon. The building remembers. It remembers every lie that got gavelled into truth. And your boy Miguel. His case is singing the same old sad song. Sam felt the weight of it then. The parallels were undeniable. The ranch hand, the pay dispute, the blunt instrument, the convenient suspect. He wasn't just fighting a prosecution. He was fighting a ghost. A ghost the courthouse itself was making tangible. The witnesses he'd seen and heard weren't random. They were the audience, the jury, the victims of case number 114, bleeding through time, demanding to be seen. He wasn't just building a defense for Miguel Reyes. He was being drafted to retry Jeremiah McCullough. And the courthouse, the spectral archivist, would be his judge, his gallery, and his relentless, haunting opponent. Part 2. The weight of the ledger Sam's world became a palimpsest, the present forever threatening to peel away and reveal the bloody past beneath. He dove into the archives with a new, grim purpose, no longer just seeking precedent, but hunting for a ghost. Case number 114 was shockingly thin. A meager folder containing the indictment, a list of evidence, hammer, bloodstained shirt, the 2-day trial transcript, and the execution order. No photo of Jeremiah McCullough existed in the file, only a physical description. 25 years, dark hair, 5'10", laborer. But the building provided its own evidence. Now that Sam was looking, the manifestations became more directed, less like hauntings and more like evidence being presented. In the main courtroom where his own case would be tried, he stayed late one evening. The empty room was a cathedral of shadows. As he stood at the defense table, the air grew thick and cold. The distinctive rhythmic sound of a gallows trapdoor slamming open. Thwump crack echoed through the chamber, though it had no source. It was followed by the sickening wet snap of a rope going taut. Sam doubled over, the phantom rope around his neck again, his vision spotting. He heard not a cheer from a 1932 crowd, but a collective, held breath of horror, and a single muffled sob from the gallery behind him. When the sensation passed, he was on his knees. On the defense table, where no condensation could be, a perfect circle of dampness had formed. As he watched, a single grimy fingerprint smeared its edge, as if someone had just steadied themselves against the wood. He was being shown the execution. He was being made to feel it. His research into the parallels grew obsessive. Boyd Hackett, the modern victim, was found in an equipment shed. Thaddeus Boone in 1932 was found in a barn, both with blunt force trauma to the head. The wrench in Miguel's case, the hammer in Jeremiah's. Miguel was isolated, a recent immigrant with few connections. Jeremiah was the son of a poor sharecropper from the wrong side of the county, a family with a reputation for trouble. The most chilling parallel was the witness. In 1932, the star witness was Boone's foreman, a man named Clyde Duvall, who claimed he saw Jeremiah fleeing the barn. In 2023, the star witness was Hackett's nephew, Tyler, who claimed he saw Miguel arguing with Hackett and later lurking near the shed. Both witnesses had shaky, self-serving testimony. Duvall had owed Boone money. Tyler stood to inherit a portion of Hackett's lease. Sam wasn't just building a defense. He was building a case for posthumous exoneration. But how do you cross-examine a ghost? How do you introduce spectral evidence into a modern court? He began to experiment. He started speaking aloud in the archives, addressing the empty air. Jeremiah McCullough, I see you, I hear you, I am trying case number 429, help me. The responses were subtle but undeniable. A ledger book would fall open to a specific page detailing a property transfer from Thaddeus Boone to his son Silas, just weeks before the murder motive never explored in 1932. A cold spot would settle over a box containing Silas Boone's later civil suits, revealing him as a litigious, greedy man. One night, as Sam pored over the 1932 trial transcript, the words on the page seemed to swim. For a moment, the sterile legal language was overwritten by a frantic, handwritten scrawl in the margins, invisible until now. Liar! Duval liar, S. Boone paid him? The ink was brown, like dried blood, and it faded after a few seconds, leaving Sam's heart hammering. He was being coached by a ghost. The courthouse was acting as a medium, channeling the unresolved fury of a century-old injustice directly into his defense strategy. But the pressure was taking its toll. Sam began experiencing bleed-through in his own life. Driving home, he'd catch the scent of hay and horse sweat in his car. The face of the old judge from the 1932 photograph would stare back at him from his bathroom mirror for a paralyzing second. He woke one night from a dream of rough hemp on his neck to find faint, bruise-like discolorations on his own throat. The past wasn't just haunting him, it was marking him. His modern case was foundering. The prosecution was airtight on procedure. Miguel, scared and confused, was a terrible witness for himself. Sam's ethereal research was legally worthless. He needed something tangible. A break. He found it where the building directed him. In the basement, behind a disused filing cabinet, he found a loose stone. Behind it was a cavity, and in the cavity, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound diary. It belonged to Eliza McCullough, Jeremiah's sister. The entries were heart-wrenching accounts of the trial, the family's shame, their poverty. And on the last page, dated the day after the execution, a single furious sentence. Clyde Duval drank himself blind at the saloon last night. He kept saying, the eyes in the loft, over and over. Silas Boone paid his tab and took him home. God sees the truth, but waits. The eyes in the loft. The Boone barn had a hayloft. The original investigation never properly searched it. The prosecution said Jeremiah struck Boone on the ground floor and fled. What if the killer had been hiding up there? It was a thread, a ghostly thread, but a thread. Sam had no physical evidence from 1932, but he had a modern crime scene with a similar layout. What if the killer in his case had used the same hiding place? He drove out to the Callahan equipment shed in the middle of the night. It was a near replica of an old barn structure. With a flashlight, he climbed into the dusty, cobweb-choked loft. He saw nothing at first. Then his light caught it. Not evidence from his case, but from the old one. Wedged between two rafters, fossilized by time and grime, was a single tarnished brass cufflink monogrammed S.B. Silas Boone. The building hadn't just given him a story. It had given him an artifact. It had preserved evidence for a century, waiting for a lawyer who would listen to its ghosts. But as he held the cufflink, the shed around him wavered. The corrugated metal walls seemed to become rough-hewn wood. The smell of oil and dust became the scent of hay and animals. He heard the muffled argument from below. Not Miguel and Hackett, but the gruff voices of Thaddeus Boone and his son Silas. A raised voice, a curse, the sound of a struggle, and the terrible wet thud of the hammer. Sam wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was a witness for case number 114. And from the shadows of the loft, a pair of eyes, not human eyes, but the pale, desperate eyes of the young man from the restroom mirror met his. Jeremiah McCullough's ghost was here, in the place of his condemnation, showing Sam the truth. Not just to help Miguel, but to force Sam to see it, to feel the weight of the lie that had stolen his life. Sam stumbled out of the shed, the modern world snapping back into place, the cufflink clutched in his shaking hand. He had his link. He had the parallel. But he also had a new, terrifying understanding. To win case number 429, he would have to put the ghost of Silas Boone on trial. He would have to stand in his modern courtroom and, using the echoes of the past, accuse a dead man of murder. He would have to force the courthouse to listen to its own buried verdict, and in doing so, risk becoming permanently entangled in its endless, ghostly docket. Part 3. The Retrial. The day of the trial for case number 429 arrived, heavy and still. The grand courtroom was packed, the air buzzing with the living. But for Sam Holloway, the room was doubly occupied. He saw the modern spectators, the jury, the judge. But overlaying them, like a double exposure from a haunted camera, he saw the ghosts. They sat in the same benches, stood at the back. The man in the modern sweater, the weeping woman in the cloche hat, the gaunt young man with the bruised eyes. Jeremiah. They were silent, spectral witnesses, their collective gaze a physical pressure on the back of Sam's neck. His plan was legal madness. He couldn't introduce the cufflink as evidence for his current case. It was irrelevant, prejudicial, a century old. He couldn't call a ghost to the stand. But he could use the pattern. He could put the past itself on trial through the present. The prosecution presented its case with slick efficiency. The wrench, the fingerprints, Tyler Hackett's damning testimony. Miguel looked smaller and more doomed with each passing hour. When it was Sam's turn, He began conventionally, picking apart the forensic gaps, highlighting Tyler's inheritance motive. The jury listened, some skeptical, some bored. The ghosts watched, unmoving. Then, Sam made his move. "Your Honor, the defense calls Mr. Roy Clements to the stand." The old bailiff Roy shuffled up, sworn in. Sam didn't ask him about Miguel's case. "Mr. Clements, you've worked in this courthouse for 45 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir." "You're familiar with its history?" "Objection, relevance?" the prosecutor snapped. "I'm establishing the witness's knowledge of local historical patterns, Your Honor," Sam said. "Patterns which bear directly on the credibility of testimony in this case." The judge, an old-school jurist named Peterson, peered over his glasses. He felt the strange weight in the room, too. Sam could see it in his eyes. "I'll allow it. Proceed." Sam led Roy through a careful recitation of the history of the county, the ranch disputes, the tensions. Then he asked, "Are you aware of a case from 1932, case number 114, the state of Texas versus Jeremiah McCullough?" The prosecutor was on his feet. "Objection. This is a blatant attempt to introduce prejudicial historical hearsay." "Your Honor," Sam pressed, his voice rising, "I am not introducing the details of that case as evidence. I am introducing the pattern of injustice as a framework to examine the pattern of testimony in this case. The witness's knowledge of local history is relevant to the jury's understanding of potential bias and recycled narratives." Judge Peterson stroked his chin. The courtroom was utterly silent. The air grew colder. Sam saw his breath fog for a second. In the jury box, one juror shivered and pulled her cardigan tight. "Overruled," the judge said quietly. "But tread carefully, Mr. Holloway." Sam turned back to Roy. "Tell the jury, in broad terms, what case number 114 was about." Roy's voice was a dry rasp in the cold room. "Ranch hand, accused of killing his boss in a pay dispute. One eyewitness, the foreman, a bloody hammer, convicted quick, hanged." "And what was the outcome for the eyewitness, a man named Clyde Duvall?" "He was paid off by the victim's son, Silas Boone. Drank himself to death a few years later, tormented, they say." "And the victim's son, Silas Boone?" "Inherited the ranch, sold it off in pieces, died rich in San Antonio in 1960. Sam let that hang in the chilling air. He then presented a blown-up diagram of the 1932 Boone barn, and next to it, a diagram of the Callahan equipment shed. The similarities were striking. He pointed to the loft in each. "The official story in 1932, Sam said, his voice now echoing in the spectral silence, was that the murder happened on the ground floor. The loft was never searched. But what if the real killer was there? Watching? What if the eyewitness saw not the fleeing ranch hand, but the real killer descending from the loft after the fact? He was arguing a ghost story, but he was doing it with the cold logic of a lawyer. The prosecutor's objections were sustained, but the seed was planted. The jury was looking at the diagrams, at Tyler Hackett, with new eyes. In his closing argument, Sam abandoned all pretense of separating the cases. He stood before the jury, feeling the icy breath of the ghostly gallery on him, the phantom rope a faint, aching memory around his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice low and intense, "you are not just deciding the fate of Miguel Reyes. You are auditing a ledger this very building has kept for almost a century. On one page, an entry from 1932, Jeremiah McCullough. A convenient suspect, a shaky witness, a rushed judgment. The ledger notes, paid in full with a life." He walked to the evidence table and picked up the wrench, then pointed to the diagram of the shed's loft. "Now turn the page. 2023, Miguel Reyes. A convenient suspect. A shaky witness with something to gain. The same geography of violence. The same rush to closure. The ledger is poised to make another entry." He put the wrench down and faced them squarely, the ghosts at his back. You have the power to close that old ledger, to look at the pattern and say, no more, to demand more than just a story that fits. To look up, he said, gesturing toward the ceiling of the courtroom, a universal gesture for the loft, for the hidden truth, and see what everyone else is afraid to see. You can give Miguel Reyes his future, and in doing so, you can finally give Jeremiah McCullough his long overdue acquittal. He sat down. The courtroom was so quiet he could hear the electric hum of the clock, the ragged breath of Miguel beside him. And underneath it, he heard something else. A soft, collective exhalation, like a sigh of release from 100 ghostly lungs. The jury was out for 8 hours. 8 hours Sam spent in his office, not looking at files, just staring at the wall. The cold spots were gone. The smells had vanished. The courthouse was holding its breath. The verdict was not guilty. The modern courtroom erupted. Miguel embraced his family, sobbing. The prosecutor gathered his papers, stone-faced. As the crowd filtered out, Sam felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. He was the last to leave the courtroom. As he turned off the lights, he looked back. For a moment, in the gloom, he saw them one last time. The spectral gallery was still there, but they were different. The man in the modern sweater was fading. The weeping woman's head was raised. And Jeremiah McCullough, the gaunt young man, stood by the defense table. He wasn't looking at Sam with desperation anymore. He met Sam's gaze and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned, and all the ghosts dissolved like mist in a sudden sunbeam, leaving the courtroom empty, silent, and finally, truly at rest. Case number 429 was closed. And in the eternal archives of the Gonzales County Courthouse, a footnote was finally, quietly, added to case number 114. Witnessed and absolved, 2023. Sam walked out into the Texas night. The weight on his shoulders was gone, replaced by a different, lighter burden. The knowledge of the thin veneer between present and past, and the permanent, ghostly docket that lies just beneath the surface of every blindfolded Lady Justice. He had been a witness, and he would never see a courtroom or the pursuit of truth the same way again.